During my first year in junior high, I came across one of the most painful short stories I have ever read, The Baby in the Bottle by Benjamin Bautista. To give you the gist, it tells the story of a couple struggling to live their lives after losing their first child. The husband, Mr. Libre, narrates the story, describing her wife in the most heart-wrenching manner. She would touch the bottle gently and once in a while run her hands fondly over the cold glass. Inside, the stiff, skinless body of a 4-inch boy, now dead for 5 years, would bob up and down in the green alcohol. And then sometimes, slowly, to herself, she would smile. Reading the story from the husband's perspective, our English class back then generally agreed that the wife was experiencing mental deterioration due to this devastating loss. Most of my classmates also thought that it was the husband, Mr. Libre, who was trying to hold things together for the both of them. But I thought differently. For me, it was the wife who was showing strength at this most vulnerable time. When my teacher asked me why, I said the touching of the bottle was her own way of grieving. It is her own process through which she confronts her loss. I also argued that it was the husband who seemed to constantly avoid this painful reality, thereby shrugging it off, if not running away from it. While one was trying to remember, the other was trying to forget. This courageous act of remembering is absent in the husband's storytelling, but very visible in the wife's bodily response to loss. Her touch work reminds me of the time when I lost my grandfather 5 years before I encountered this text. The way I cling to a bracelet he gave me on my birthday. The way my titos and titas touched the glass of his coffin during the funeral. The way my grandmother, who was still alive at that time, wept over his worn clothes from his closets. Language may not be able to convey it, but our bodies, our hands in particular, can reveal or silence strength in the face of loss. 9 years later, I found myself unexpectedly taking on the role of teaching literature. Currently, I work as an instructor at the University of the Philippines, Diliman in Quezon City, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree in English. During my undergraduate training, I became deeply interested in, and eventually fell in love with an academic discipline that explores more than human language. That is, semiotics. You might not have heard this term before, but to put it plainly, semiotics is the study of signs, their systems, and the processes by which they create meanings. Signs can be anything: visual, oral, linguistic, spatial, gestural, material, basically anything that signifies something beyond itself, anything that can represent but also challenge or maintain reality. Studying semiotics, however, not only involves knowing these sign systems, but also revealing whose realities are privileged and whose realities are relegated to the margins. In my view, semiotics offers a way of understanding the world beyond what is shown on the surface. As a semiotic enthusiast with critical training in language studies, I have always prefaced my literature classes not with definitional questions like, what is literature, or what qualifies as literature, but with more political inquiries such as, what kinds of texts have we been commanded to read? And how do these works of literature expose whose ideological position, systems of values, and historical narratives are privileged and whose are silenced? In my classes, we view literature not only as vessels of stories, but as institutional mechanisms that may reproduce, negotiate, or subvert broader social, cultural, and political realities. An interesting observation that my classes usually make is that most of the texts that we discuss in my classes usually rely on the perspectives and experiences of men, often leaving the voices and narratives of women underrepresented, if not totally absent. As a literature teacher, I am confronted with pedagogical questions like, how do we approach such texts imbued with patriarchal values? How do we read the female characters in these literary works where their voices, narratives, and experiences are intentionally silenced? How can we locate their agency as human beings within these male-biased texts? I thus ask, how can we read women in literature the semiotic way? Allow me to share with you how I do it. In UP Diliman, I have been teaching literature and society, one of the general education offered by our departments. In our Module 6, if I can go to our Module 6, please, titled, no, that's not the slide there, Monstrous Myth. We investigated the notion of desire in Gabriella Lee's Hunger. Can we project the slide, please? In Gabriella Lee's Hunger. Right there. No? This short story narrates the coming-of-age adventures of a female adolescent and how she navigates her desires by transforming into a manananggal. This transformation, however, is not literal, but metaphorical, which mirrors the experiences of women undergoing abortion in the Philippines. Can we go to the slide, please? During our discussion, I asked my students, do you think the figure of the manananggal is a suitable figure to represent the issue of abortion in the Philippines? What makes it so? One of my students hastily remarked, it is. Can you go to the next slide, please? There. Next slide as well. It is. The manananggal's capacity to sip blood and take human life reflects a woman undergoing abortion, taking the life of an unborn child. The rest of my class saw this reading as problematic because it reduces the issue of abortion as a simple matter of, quote-unquote, taking someone else's life. And this is when I threw the semiotic questions of space. What happens with the body of a manananggal, with the body of a woman who transforms into a manananggal? And how does this transformation affect her movement across spaces? We arrived at an interesting answer. The upper body of the manananggal flies and escapes surveillance, allowing herself to satisfy her desires, which in the context of the story means engaging in sexual activities. While the upper half is on the prowl, the lower half remains in a particular place, thereby securing the girl's reproductive body and protecting her from the dire consequences of pregnancy. Seen in her spatial mobility, the manananggal embodies female transgression by exploring rather than suppressing her adolescent desires, therefore claiming agency over her body. Now, here's the thing. What if there aren't any significant semiotic resources in the narrative? What if there's no space to examine? This is the case for Module 7, titled The Political Bleeds into the Personal, where we read Art Spiegelman's Mouse. This graphic novel narrates the experiences of the author's father, Vladek, during the Holocaust. But more than that, this graphic novel also depicts the complex and fractured relationship between the father and the son, who is Artie himself, the author. The main objective of this module is simply to map out the psychological and systemic dimensions of war and violence. But we cannot help but also point out the absence of female voice in the narrative, particularly the voice of the author's mother, Anja, who also survived the Holocaust, but later on committed suicide due to depression. Anja, however, had a diary, which quite intriguingly was burned by Vladek, because he found it too painful to read. Our class then was confronted by this missing voice, by a very important female character. How then do we read her absence? How do we excavate her presence with this deliberate omission? Surprisingly enough, one of my students attentively pointed out that there is one visual trace of Anja that we can find in the graphic novel, and that is a photo of her with Artie as a young boy. Mind you, it is her only remaining trace throughout the entire text. What then can we make of this last trace? During our discussion, I brought up the semiotic notion of index, which is a kind of sign that makes reference to things in the world by pointing to or locating itself in or on them. In this sense, Anja's visual image not only resembles her, nor symbolizes her, but provides material evidence of her presence, suggesting that she was once here, existing in the world after the Holocaust. And therefore, her death, her absence, is what makes her a hunting force, a relentless ghost that resists the closure of Vladek's narrative. By reading Anja's visual trace as an index, we were able to invoke her spectral presence and give her some sense of agency or power in this male-dominated narrative. As you've seen so far, reading about the female figures in the literary texts that we tackle is as challenging as it is revelatory. It is, for me, an excavation work. Our role as readers is not only to uncover the existing power structures that shape women's positions in these narratives, but also, and perhaps more importantly, locates and collects every bit of evidence that would allow us to resist dominant views on women as weak, as passive, as vulnerable, as irrational. The purpose of this semiotic task is not to glorify women, nor to gloss over the structural forces that regulate and control their lives, but ultimately to surface what the feminist Fiona Gray calls situated agency, a kind of agency that is simultaneously free and restricted, a perspective that sees women as both acted on by and capable of choosing to act within the patriarchal gender order. Thinking about women this way, both in literature or in real world, can, as Vera Gray puts it, help us resist the temptation to see women's responses to male violence and intrusion as evidence of their lack of agency, without feeling obliged to go to the other extreme and suggest that their actions are expressions of freedom. This, folks, this, I believe, is the semiotic way of reading women in literature. When language becomes a tool of oppression, we must turn to other semiotic resources and practices as potential sites of negotiation and resistance. Anja's remaining visual trace in Spiegelman's Mouse, the body transformation and spatial movement of the Manananggal in Lee's Hunger, the touchwork of Mrs. Libre and Bautista's The Baby in the Bottle. To be semiotic readers, then, is not to passively absorb, but rather actively recreate or excavate meanings in what we read, hoping that this extends beyond literature and penetrates the many and equal ways we live our lives. Many thanks, everyone.